At 8:53 Moscow time on May 1, 1960, Soviet radar operators stared at their screens in disbelief. A single blip crawled across the display at an altitude that should have been impossible, 21 kilometers above the Ural Mountains, nearly 70,000 feet. Higher than any aircraft they had ever tracked, higher than any of their fighters could reach, higher than their missiles were supposed to touch. In command posts across the Soviet Union, officers scrambled to their stations. Telephones rang with increasing urgency. At the highest levels of the Kremlin, Defense Minister Marshal Rodion Malinovsky woke Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev with news that would change the course of the Cold War. An American spy plane was violating Soviet airspace on the most important holiday of the communist calendar, May Day. The celebration of Soviet power and military strength. Khrushchev's response was immediate and furious. He telephoned Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, and berated him with words that would echo through the command structure. "It is a scandal," he shouted. "The country gave all the necessary resources to the troops of air defense, yet you cannot destroy a subsonic plane." Biryuzov, one of the most decorated commanders in the Soviet military, could only respond with frustration. "If I could become a missile," he said, "I myself would fly and down this damned intruder." For 4 years, the Soviets had watched helplessly as American U-2 aircraft penetrated their airspace with impunity. They tracked every flight. They scrambled fighters that could never reach high enough. They fired missiles that fell short. And they seethed with humiliation as American cameras photographed their most secret military installations. But on this May Day morning, everything was about to change. The aircraft at the center of this confrontation was the Lockheed U-2, one of the most remarkable flying machines ever created. Designed by the legendary Kelly Johnson at Lockheed's Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California, the U-2 was essentially a jet-powered glider built for a single, extraordinary purpose: sustained flight at altitudes above 70,000 feet, where the air is so thin that conventional aircraft cannot fly. The U-2 stretched nearly 50 feet in length with a wingspan of 80 feet, far longer than the fuselage itself. Those enormous wings gave it the lift needed to soar at the edge of space. The aircraft weighed just under 18,000 pounds fully loaded and was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine, producing 17,000 pounds of thrust. At its operational altitude, the margin between stall speed and maximum speed narrowed to just 10 knots. Pilots called this razor-thin envelope the coffin corner, because a slight miscalculation in either direction would cause the aircraft to fall out of the sky. What made the U-2 truly revolutionary was not just its altitude capability, but what it carried. The aircraft's reconnaissance systems represented the cutting edge of 1950s intelligence technology. Its primary sensor was the HICON B camera, designed by Dr. James Baker of Harvard University. This remarkable instrument could photograph a swath of terrain 125 miles wide with resolution sharp enough to identify objects smaller than 1 meter across from an altitude of 65,000 feet. A single mission could photograph an area of 1,400,000 square miles. The Central Intelligence Agency had commissioned the aircraft under a $22.5 million contract, and Lockheed delivered all 20 original aircraft for under $19 million. President Dwight Eisenhower personally authorized the overflights of Soviet territory, viewing them as essential to preventing a nuclear surprise attack. The Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb in 1949 and their first hydrogen bomb in 1953. American intelligence desperately needed to know the true extent of Soviet nuclear capabilities. The U-2 was their answer. The aircraft's development had been remarkably swift. Kelly Johnson submitted his initial design proposal in late 1954. The first U-2 flew on August 1, 1955, less than 9 months later. The program was so secret that even the Air Force did not know about it initially. Pilots were recruited from fighter squadrons and told only that they would be flying a new high-altitude aircraft for weather research. Only after they agreed did they learn the true nature of their mission. The first overflight of the Soviet Union took place on July 4, 1956, Independence Day. The pilot was Hervey Stockman. The mission flew as far north as Leningrad to photograph naval shipyards, then west to the Baltic states to photograph bomber bases. Soviet radar tracked the aircraft perfectly, but Soviet fighters could not reach it. The next day, pilot Carmine Vito became the only American ever to fly directly over Moscow. The pattern was established. American cameras would photograph Soviet secrets while Soviet pilots watched helplessly from miles below. The year 1960 found the world balanced on a knife edge of nuclear tension. The Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase. Both superpowers possessed hydrogen bombs capable of destroying entire cities. Both were racing to build intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver those warheads across oceans in minutes, and both lived with the constant fear that the other might strike first. The previous 4 years had witnessed an extraordinary campaign of aerial espionage over the Soviet Union. Since July 4, 1956, when the first U-2 crossed into Soviet airspace, American aircraft had penetrated the most closely guarded secrets of the communist superpower. Operation Grand Slam would be the 24th such overflight. Each mission violated every principle of international law and sovereignty. Each mission risked war between nuclear-armed powers. And each mission returned with intelligence so valuable that American leaders considered the risk worthwhile. The Soviets knew about every flight. Their radar tracked the intruders from border to border. Colonel Alexander Orlov, a retired Soviet officer who served on the Air Defense Main Staff, confirmed in a 1998 CIA publication that Soviet radar had tracked U-2 flights from their very beginning, though with some gaps in coverage. The humiliation was profound. Soviet leaders publicly denied the overflights were happening because admitting them would reveal their inability to stop them. Privately, they raged at their military commanders and demanded solutions. For the United States, the fear that drove these missions manifested in what became known as the missile gap. American intelligence believed the Soviets might possess hundreds of operational intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at American cities. The reality, as the U-2 flights would eventually reveal, was far different. The Soviets had only a handful of operational missiles. But in 1960, American leaders could not know this with certainty. The stakes of ignorance were existential. Against this backdrop of mutual suspicion, a fragile hope for peace had emerged. A summit conference was scheduled to begin in Paris on May 16, bringing together Eisenhower, Khrushchev, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and French President Charles de Gaulle. The agenda included discussions of arms control, the status of Berlin, and the possibility of reducing Cold War tensions. Khrushchev had even invited Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union that summer. For Eisenhower, the summit represented the culmination of years of careful diplomacy. He genuinely wanted to reduce the risk of nuclear war. He understood that continued hostility benefited neither superpower, and he was preparing to end his presidency on a note of peace rather than confrontation. But Eisenhower also understood that intelligence collection could not stop simply because diplomacy was progressing. In a declassified memorandum dated April 25, his staff secretary, General Andrew Goodpaster, recorded the president's authorization for one additional U-2 overflight of the Soviet Union, provided it was completed before May 1. No operation was to be carried out after that date. The Paris summit was too important to risk. Weather delays pushed the mission from April 28 to April 29 to April 30. Each postponement brought the deadline closer. Finally, on May 1 itself, the mission launched. It technically exceeded Eisenhower's own deadline by hours. This decision, driven by the desperate need to photograph the suspected missile site at Plesetsk, would prove catastrophic. The pilot selected for this mission was Francis Gary Powers, a 30-year-old former Air Force officer from Jenkins, Kentucky. Powers had grown up in Appalachian coal mining country, the son of a shoe repairman who later worked in the mines. He joined the Air Force in 1950 and trained as a fighter pilot. His skills caught the attention of CIA recruiters in 1956. They offered him substantially higher pay than his military salary, approximately $2,500 per month, to fly a new secret aircraft that would change the nature of intelligence gathering. The U-2 pilots were technically civilians who had resigned their military commissions to work for the CIA. This legal fiction was designed to provide plausible deniability if a pilot was captured. The government could claim he was not a military officer conducting military operations. The fiction would prove useless when Powers was captured with overwhelming evidence of his true mission. May 1, 1960, began for Powers at Peshawar Air Station in Pakistan. He had been waiting for days as weather delays scrubbed mission after mission. Now, finally, the meteorologists reported acceptable conditions over the target areas. Powers went through his pre-flight routine, donned his pressure suit, and received his final briefing. The mission was designated Operation Grand Slam. It would be the most ambitious U-2 overflight ever attempted, the first planned complete south-to-north transit of the Soviet Union. Powers would fly approximately 3,800 miles over 9 hours, photographing the most sensitive Soviet military installations along the way. His targets included the Tyuratam Cosmodrome, where the Soviets launched their intercontinental missiles, the Chelyabinsk plutonium processing facility, the military-industrial complexes around Sverdlovsk, and most importantly, the suspected missile site at Plesetsk. His destination was Bodo Military Airfield in Norway. Powers was assigned Article 360, a U-2C with the Air Force serial number 56-6693. It had a poor reputation among the pilots. They called it a dog because of its chronic fuel feed problems. It was a substitute for the preferred aircraft, Article 358, which had been grounded for maintenance. Powers knew the aircraft's quirks but accepted the mission anyway. At approximately 6:26 in the morning local time, Powers lifted off from Peshawar and climbed toward the stars. The sky above darkened from blue to black as he ascended through 50,000 feet, then 60,000 feet, finally leveling off near 70,000 feet. Below him, the brown and white landscape of the Hindu Kush gave way to the Soviet border. The weather in Pakistan had been warm and clear. Along his route, visibility was excellent, with scattered clouds far below that would not interfere with photography. Powers settled into the routine of high-altitude flight, monitoring his instruments, checking his navigation, and preparing to activate his cameras as he crossed into denied territory. Everything seemed normal. His pressure suit functioned properly. His oxygen flow was steady. The Hicom B camera was ready. Only the autopilot gave him trouble, its Mach sensor causing repeated nose pitch-ups that required manual correction. Powers considered turning back but decided against it. He had waited too long for this mission. He was determined to accomplish what he had set out to do. At 5:36 in the morning Moscow time, Powers crossed into Soviet airspace over the Premier Mountains near the Afghan border. Within minutes, Soviet early warning radar detected his aircraft. Operators at stations across the southern Soviet Union began tracking the intruder, plotting its course northward toward the heart of the motherland. The reports flowed upward through the chain of command with increasing urgency. From local radar stations to the Air Defense District Command Post in Sverdlovsk, where Deputy Commander Major General F.K. Solodovnikov was acting in command while his superior was away on a training course. From there to Air Defense Headquarters in Moscow, where 3 senior commanders assembled to manage the response. Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, Commander-in-Chief of Air Defense Forces, Marshal Yevgeny Savitsky, Commander of Air Defense Aviation, known by his personal radio call sign Dragon, and Colonel General Pavel Kuleshov, Commander of Anti-Aircraft Artillery and Missiles. When Khrushchev received the news and finished berating his commanders, he issued an order that would define the day. The intruder was to be destroyed regardless of cost. To ensure the radar operators could concentrate on the single target, Khrushchev ordered all civilian air traffic across the entire Soviet Union grounded. Every commercial flight was cancelled. Every aircraft already airborne was ordered to land immediately. The skies of the Soviet Union belonged to the intruder and to those hunting him. Along the route of the U-2, Soviet air defense forces scrambled every available interceptor. The response was massive. Fighters launched from bases in Central Asia, from Tyuratam near the Cosmodrome, from Chelyabinsk, from Sverdlovsk. At least 8 aircraft were thrown at the intruder at various points along his path. Every one of them failed. The fundamental problem was physics. Powers cruised at 70,000 feet. The best Soviet fighters of the era, the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-19, had a service ceiling of approximately 57,000 to 59,000 feet. Even the newer Sukhoi Su-9, the most advanced interceptor in the Soviet inventory, could only briefly touch 65,000 feet in a zoom climb. None of them could sustain flight at the altitude where Powers operated. Pilots from Turatam launched without even having pressure suits. They never made contact with the target. Powers watched their contrails far below and noted that if this was the best they could do, he had nothing to worry about. Near Chelyabinsk, a Su-9 was scrambled but launched too early, ran short of fuel, and made an emergency landing on grass at the small airfield at Troitsk. It was the first time anyone had landed a Su-9 on grass. The aircraft survived. The intercept did not. As Powers approached Sverdlovsk, the Soviet response reached its most desperate intensity. This was the heart of the Soviet military-industrial complex. Nuclear weapons facilities and secret research centers dotted the landscape. Air defense commanders knew that if the intruder photographed these installations, the damage to Soviet security would be catastrophic. Captain Igor Mentyukov was grabbed from Koltsovo Air Base near Sverdlovsk. He had been on a routine delivery flight from the Novosibirsk factory, flying a Su-9 that was unarmed. He had no pressure suit. None of that mattered to the commanders on the ground. General Yuri Vovk, commander of air defense fighter interceptors in the Sverdlovsk district, ordered him airborne with extraordinary instructions. "There is a real target at high altitude," came the radio message. "The mission is to destroy the target. To ram it. Dragon has ordered this." Mentyukov understood what he was being asked to do. He was being ordered to sacrifice his life by flying his aircraft directly into the intruder. His wife was expecting a child. As he climbed toward his certain death, he transmitted a final message. "Take care of my wife and mother." He jettisoned his drop tanks, accelerated to Mach 1.9, and climbed through 65,000 feet. Ground controllers reported the target only 25 kilometers away, but Mentyukov's radar showed only interference. The U-2 was equipped with an electronic countermeasures device codenamed Granger that jammed Soviet radar. Mentyukov could not see his target. He overshot without visual contact and returned to land, out of fuel. The ram attack had failed. Meanwhile, 2 MiG-19s from the 764th Fighter Aviation Regiment were repositioned from Bolshoi Savino Airport near Perm to Koltsovo. Flight leader Captain Boris Ivazyan and wingman Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov took off approximately 10 minutes before what would become the critical engagement, but they could not locate the intruder either. They orbited at roughly 33,000 feet, less than half the U-2 altitude, waiting for guidance that would never help them reach their target. At the surface-to-air missile batteries ringing Sverdlovsk, crews stood ready at their S-75 Divina systems. Known to Western intelligence as the SA-2 guideline, these were the newest weapons in the Soviet arsenal. Unlike older systems, the S-75 with its V-750VN missile could engage targets at up to 30,000 meters, more than 98,000 feet. For the first time, the Soviets had a weapon that could touch Powers. The S-75 system had entered service in 1957 and represented a quantum leap in Soviet air defense capability. Each battery consisted of 6 launcher rails arranged in a star pattern around a central fan-song fire control radar. The radar could track targets at ranges up to 180 kilometers. The V-750VN missile stretched nearly 11 meters long and weighed over 2,300 kilograms at launch. Its solid fuel booster ignited first. Then a liquid fuel sustainer motor took over, propelling it to speeds exceeding Mach 3. The missile did not need a direct hit. Its 195-kilogram warhead would detonate by proximity fuse when it sensed the target nearby. 6 S-75 batteries defended the Sverdlovsk area. 4 of them would fire that morning. The engagement that followed would last approximately 40 minutes and descend into chaos. At 8:46 Moscow time, the battery at Poldnevaya, approximately 30 nautical miles south of Sverdlovsk, opened fire. Deputy Commander Boris Samoylov ordered the first missile launched. Technical difficulties prevented additional launches from this battery. A single missile streaked upward toward the target at 70,000 feet. 6 minutes later, at 8:52, the battery at Koselino, southeast of Sverdlovsk, engaged. Acting Commander Major Mikhail Voronov ordered a salvo of 3 missiles, but only 1 launched. A safety lock on the firing button prevented the other 2. This battery would later receive official credit for destroying the U-2. Voronov would receive the Order of the Red Banner. At 70,000 feet, Powers was making a 90-degree left turn to photograph targets southwest of Sverdlovsk when his world exploded. There was a dull thump, he would later report. The aircraft jerked forward, and a tremendous orange flash lit the cockpit and sky. His immediate thought was simple and terrifying. My God, I have had it now. The missile had not scored a direct hit. It detonated approximately 20 meters behind and below the aircraft. The warhead dispersed approximately 3,600 shotgun-type pellets in an expanding forward cone. Shrapnel pierced the tail and rear fuselage. The wings were torn away by the force of the blast and the aerodynamic stress. Powers, shielded by the engine and aircraft structure, survived the initial impact. But the U-2 was dying. The nose dropped uncontrollably. The aircraft began to spin, the fuselage inverted, nose up, tail down. Centrifugal forces reached 4 times normal gravity, pinning Powers in his seat. He tried to reach the ejection handles but could not. His legs were trapped beneath the canopy rail. If he activated the ejection seat, his legs would be severed. Powers released the canopy. Wind screamed into the cockpit. He reached for the self-destruct switches that would destroy the aircraft's sensitive equipment, but decided to ensure his own exit first. He pulled the emergency oxygen handle and released his seat belt. Centrifugal force immediately threw him halfway out of the cockpit. But his oxygen hoses held him tethered to the dying aircraft, his legs dangling in the void, the ground 17 miles below. He kicked and twisted until the hoses separated. Free of the aircraft at last, he tumbled through the stratosphere. He could no longer reach the destruct switches. The U-2 and all its secrets would fall intact into Soviet hands. His parachute opened automatically at approximately 15,000 feet via barometric trigger. As he descended beneath his parachute canopy, Powers took stock of his situation. He was alive. He was about to land in the Soviet Union. And he carried items that could condemn him as a spy. In his pocket was a silver dollar containing a grooved needle coated with saxitoxin, a lethal paralytic toxin. The poison was optional, provided to pilots who chose to carry it. Powers removed the needle from the silver dollar and placed it in his pocket. He discarded the coin, yet he was still hopeful of escape. He landed in a ploughed field near the village of Kosolino. 2 farm workers helped him to his feet. Within minutes, Soviet authorities arrived. Powers was taken into custody and transported under heavy guard to Lubyanka prison in Moscow, the headquarters of the KGB. Behind him, the wreckage of the U-2 fell across the Soviet countryside. Remarkably, far more survived intact than the CIA had assumed possible. Soviet recovery teams found the reconnaissance cameras, exposed film containing photographs of Soviet military installations, navigation maps with the flight route clearly marked, identification documents proving Powers was an American pilot, and the poison needle he had discarded. But the chaos in the sky above Sverdlovsk was not over. At the battery at Monetny northeast of the city, Captain Nikolai Shaludko saw radar returns descending through his engagement zone. He did not know that these were pieces of the already destroyed U-2. He ordered 3 missiles fired at what he believed was the still-flying intruder. Shaludko would also receive the Order of the Red Banner. And at the battery at Resheti, west of Sverdlovsk, Commander Major A. Shugayev faced an even more tragic confusion. His radar showed 2 unidentified aircraft in his zone. They were the MiG-19s piloted by Captain Ivazyan and Senior Lieutenant Safronov, still orbiting and waiting for vectors to the intruder. But their identification friend or foe transponders had not been switched to the new May codes. Because May 1st was a holiday, they still broadcast April codes. To ground radar, they appeared hostile. Compounding the disaster, the missile command post and fighter command post occupied different floors of the same building in Sverdlovsk. Neither coordinated with the other. When Major General Solodovnikov, the deputy district commander who was acting in command that day, was asked about unidentified airborne targets in the area, he snapped that none of their planes were in the air. Shugayev's battery fired 3 SA-2 missiles at what it believed was the enemy aircraft. Captain Ivazyan heard the urgent warning from ground control. Lose height quickly. He threw his aircraft into a vertical dive, pulling out at just 1,000 feet. His radar signature vanished. He survived. Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov did not hear the warning in time. He was still at altitude on a normal approach to Koltsovo when one of Shugaev's missiles struck his MiG-19. The aircraft disintegrated. Safronov ejected and his parachute deployed. But when searchers found him on the ground, he was dead. A deep shrapnel wound in his side had killed him. He was 30 years old. His wife was named Anna. She would later marry his flight leader, Captain Ivasian, the man who survived by diving his aircraft toward the Earth while his wingman died above him. Safronov was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner, the same decoration given to the missile commanders who destroyed the U-2. Soviet newspapers never mentioned his death. The truth about the friendly fire incident would remain hidden for 30 years, emerging only during the glasnost era of the late 1980s. In total, the Soviet Air Defense Forces fired 8 missiles at various targets over Sverdlovsk that morning. They destroyed 1 American aircraft. They killed one of their own pilots. And they created a fabricated official account that their commanders repeated to Khrushchev himself. Marshal Biryuzov assembled his deputies after the engagement and announced the version that would become official truth. "This is what happened," he declared. The intruder only brushed the edge of the missile range. A pair of Su-9s reached the target. The interceptors were ordered to leave the firing area, but one pilot only shouted in reply that he was attacking. 2 missiles were launched. One hit the spy plane while the other went after our plane. The lieutenant died a hero. And that is the end of the story. There were never any other missiles. Sergei Khrushchev, the Premier's son, witnessed this exchange. The marshal looked searchingly at his deputies, he wrote later. He read agreement in their faces. This version suited everyone. Francis Gary Powers spent the next 61 days in Lubyanka prison, interrogated by the KGB for 12 to 16 hours per day. Consistent with CIA instructions that pilots were free to tell the truth about their missions with certain exceptions about aircraft specifications, he described his mission but withheld specific altitude capabilities and camera details. He was not tortured. The Soviets had enough physical evidence to prove everything they needed to know. The interrogations were exhaustive. Soviet intelligence officers questioned Powers about his training, his previous missions, the equipment aboard his aircraft, and the identities of other U-2 pilots. Powers cooperated on matters that were already obvious from the physical evidence, but resisted revealing classified technical details. His interrogators showed him reconnaissance photographs recovered from his aircraft, proving that his mission had been successful until the moment of impact. Powers was held in a cell measuring approximately 9 feet by 12 feet. He was given books to read, including works by Dostoevsky and other Russian authors. His guards treated him correctly, if not warmly. He was allowed to write letters to his wife Barbara, though all correspondence was censored. The isolation and uncertainty weighed heavily. He did not know if he would face execution, decades in prison, or eventual release. While Powers sat in his Moscow cell, the political earthquake triggered by his capture was reshaping the Cold War. Khrushchev played his hand with masterful cunning. Knowing the Americans would assume Powers was dead, he deliberately withheld the pilot's survival when he first addressed the Supreme Soviet on May 5. He announced that an American spy plane had been shot down deep in Soviet territory. He blamed CIA Director Allen Dulles specifically, offering Eisenhower a face-saving exit by suggesting the CIA had acted independently without presidential knowledge. Then he waited. The trap worked perfectly. On May 3rd, NASA issued a cover story claiming the aircraft was a weather research plane lost near Turkey after the pilot reported oxygen difficulties. On May 5th, after Khrushchev's announcement, NASA elaborated with fabricated details. A U-2 was hurriedly painted with NASA insignia and displayed to reporters. A State Department spokesman declared that there was no deliberate attempt to violate Soviet airspace, and there never had been. The cover story was elaborate. Officials claimed the aircraft had been conducting atmospheric research from its base at Adana, Turkey. The pilot had reported difficulty with his oxygen equipment over Lake Van near the Turkish-Soviet border. Radio contact was lost. A search was underway. The whole fabrication was designed to be plausible. It unraveled completely when Khrushchev revealed what the Soviets actually possessed. On May 7th, Khrushchev sprung the trap before the Supreme Soviet. "Comrades," he announced, "I must let you in on a secret. When I made my report 2 days ago, I deliberately refrained from mentioning that we have the remnants of the plane, and we also have the pilot, who is quite alive and kicking." He identified Powers by name. He displayed developed reconnaissance photographs of Soviet air bases taken from the U-2 cameras. He noted the departure from Peshawar and the intended destination of Bodo. He added with devastating sarcasm that the whole world knows Alan Dulles is no weatherman. The Eisenhower administration scrambled through escalating admissions over the following days, a partial concession on May 7th that a flight over Soviet territory was probably undertaken. Secretary of State Christian Herter's acknowledgement on May 9th that the president had authorized intelligence-gathering directives, and finally Eisenhower's full public admission on May 11th, calling the overflights a distasteful but vital necessity. The Paris summit opened on May 16th at the Élysée Palace with Eisenhower, Khrushchev, de Gaulle, and Macmillan present. It lasted a single session. Khrushchev demanded that the United States condemn the overflights, renounce future flights, and punish those responsible. Eisenhower stated that the flights had been suspended and would not resume but refused to apologize. The tension in the room was palpable. Khrushchev arrived with a prepared statement that took 45 minutes to read. He accused the United States of deliberate provocation. He questioned whether Eisenhower could control his own government. He suggested that military and intelligence officials had deliberately sabotaged the summit. De Gaulle and Macmillan attempted to mediate, proposing compromises that might salvage the conference. Nothing worked. Khrushchev's response ended any hope of détente. The Soviet government sees no possibility for productive negotiations with the United States government, he declared. It cannot be among the participants in negotiations where one of them has made treachery the basis of his policy. He rescinded Eisenhower's invitation to visit the Soviet Union. De Gaulle, attempting to salvage something from the wreckage, observed that a Soviet satellite crossed French skies 18 times a day. It made no difference. The conference adjourned on May 17th without a single substantive discussion on arms control, Berlin, or reducing Cold War tensions. Sergei Khrushchev, the Premier's son, later reflected on the damage done. His father had genuinely hoped for better relations with the United States. The personal relationship between Khrushchev and Eisenhower had been promising. Now that relationship was destroyed. The deception by his friend General Eisenhower struck his father to the heart. The younger Khrushchev wrote. Francis Gary Powers was tried from August 17th through 19th, 1960, before the military division of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union in the Hall of Columns at the House of Unions in Moscow. His 31st birthday fell on the opening day of the trial. The presiding judges were Lieutenant General Borisoglebsky, Major General Vorobyev, and Major General Zakharov. The prosecutor was Roman Rudenko, Procurator General of the Soviet Union, who had served as chief Soviet prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. Powers pleaded guilty and stated he was deeply repentant and profoundly sorry for what he had done. The prosecution displayed wreckage from his aircraft, photographs taken by his cameras, his flight maps, his survival equipment, and the poison needle. When Soviet prosecutors claimed his .22 caliber survival pistol was intended for murdering Soviet citizens, Powers replied that he could never think of shooting a person. Powers was sentenced to 10 years confinement, 3 years in prison, followed by 7 in a labor camp. He was held at Vladimir Central Prison, one of the harshest facilities in the Soviet penal system. He would not serve the full sentence. On February 10, 1962, Powers was exchanged for convicted KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel on the Glieniki Bridge, spanning the Havel River between West Berlin and Potsdam. Abel's real name was William Fischer. He had been arrested in New York in 1957 and convicted of espionage. The exchange was negotiated by James Donovan, the New York attorney who had defended Abel at trial. Donovan had argued presciently against the death penalty during sentencing because in the foreseeable future, an American of equivalent rank will be captured. His prediction had come true within 3 years. Donovan also secured the simultaneous release of American student Frederick Pryor at Checkpoint Charlie. The morning of the exchange was cold and overcast. Both sides had agreed to the procedures weeks in advance. Powers would walk east across the bridge while Abel walked west. Neither man would speak to the other. Armed guards from both nations watched from their respective ends. The exchange represented the first of its kind during the Cold War, establishing a precedent that would be repeated in future prisoner swaps. At 8:52 in the morning Berlin time, Powers and Abel crossed the bridge in opposite directions. Powers had served 1 year, 9 months, and 9 days of his sentence. The question of why the U-2 had finally been destroyed after 4 years of invulnerable overflights had both technical and political dimensions. The technical answer was the S-75 Divina system, with its improved V-750VN missile. First deployed in 1959, this weapon finally gave the Soviets the capability to engage targets at U-2 altitudes. The CIA's own internal assessment by 1960 acknowledged a high probability of successful intercept at 70,000 feet, provided that detection was made in sufficient time to alert the site. The political dimension was more troubling. Senior American officials knew the risk had increased dramatically. They authorized the May 1st flight anyway because the intelligence prize, photographs of the suspected Plesetsk missile site that could resolve the missile gap debate, seemed worth the danger. The missile gap itself proved to be an illusion. Subsequent intelligence, gathered by reconnaissance satellites rather than aircraft, revealed that the Soviets possessed far fewer intercontinental ballistic missiles than American analysts had feared. The gap favored the United States, not the Soviet Union. But this truth emerged too late to save the Paris summit or the chance for reduced Cold War tensions. The incident revealed patterns of deception on both sides that would persist throughout the Cold War. The Soviets lied about the chaotic missile engagement, the friendly fire death of Lieutenant Safronov, and the multiple batteries that fired. Marshal Biryuzov's fabricated account became official history for 3 decades. The Americans lied about the nature of the flight, claimed it was weather research when they knew it was espionage, and were caught in their deception because they assumed Powers was dead. The debate over which missile battery actually destroyed the U-2 continues to the present day. Major Voronov's battery at Koselino received official credit, and he received the Order of the Red Banner. But Boris Samoilov's battery at Poldnovaya fired 6 minutes earlier, according to timestamps in Russian Defense Ministry archives at Podolsk. Samoilov argued in a series published in VPK News in 2012 that his missile was the one that struck the aircraft. U-2 historian Chris Pocock considers Samoilov's claim credible based on the timeline evidence. Francis Gary Powers returned to the United States to face suspicion rather than welcome. Some officials questioned why he had not used the poison needle to kill himself rather than be captured. Others wondered why he had not activated the aircraft's self-destruct system. Senate Armed Services Committee hearings examined his conduct. The CIA conducted its own internal review. Powers was exonerated on all counts. The review boards concluded he had performed as well as could be expected under the circumstances. He had not activated the self-destruct because he could not reach the switches while being thrown from the spinning aircraft. He had not used the poison because it was always optional and pilots were not expected to kill themselves. But the suspicion never fully disappeared. Powers worked for Lockheed as a U-2 test pilot after his return. He later worked as a helicopter traffic reporter for a Los Angeles television station. On August 1, 1977, his helicopter crashed while covering brush fires in the Santa Barbara area. He was killed at age 47. His fuel gauge had malfunctioned, leaving him without warning that his tanks were empty. On May 1, 2000, the 40th anniversary of the shootdown, the Air Force posthumously awarded Powers the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the National Defense Service Medal at a ceremony at Beale Air Force Base. CIA Director George Tenet presented the Director's Award for Extreme Fidelity and Courage. In 2012, the Air Force posthumously awarded him the Silver Star for the valor he displayed during his interrogation in the Soviet Union. Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, the Soviet pilot killed by friendly fire on that May Day morning, received no public acknowledgement for 30 years. His family was told he died in a training accident. Only during Glasnost did the truth emerge. On the 50th anniversary of the incident in 2010, a MiG-31 interceptor at Bolshoi Savino Air Base was named in his honor. The wreckage of the U-2 that fell across the Soviet countryside was collected and reassembled for display. The remains of Article 360 are now exhibited at the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. The pilot's personal effects, including his survival equipment and the poison needle, are displayed alongside the aircraft wreckage. The Glinica Bridge, where Powers and Abel crossed in opposite directions, became known as the Bridge of Spies. It was used for 2 more Cold War prisoner exchanges in 1962 and 1985. After German reunification in 1990, the bridge was restored and opened to normal traffic. The U-2 aircraft itself remains in service more than 70 years after its first flight. Modern variants with upgraded sensors and engines continue to perform reconnaissance missions for the United States Air Force. The basic design concept that Kelly Johnson created in 1954, a jet-powered glider capable of sustained flight at extreme altitudes, proved so sound that no replacement has ever fully superseded it. The story of May 1, 1960, stands as a reminder of how quickly the course of history can change. A single flight, a single missile, a single pilot descending beneath a parachute into enemy territory. These moments rippled outward to collapse a summit, harden Cold War divisions, and shape the nuclear confrontation for years to come. Powers did not set out to make history that morning. He was a pilot following orders, doing a job he had done many times before. He expected to photograph his targets, fly to Norway, and return home. Instead, he became the center of an international crisis that exposed the deceptions of both superpowers. The Soviet commanders who scrambled to bring him down were not villains. They were military officers defending their country against what they correctly identified as a violation of their sovereignty. Lieutenant Safronov died following orders to intercept an intruder he could never have reached. Captain Mentyukov accepted what he believed would be a suicide mission to ram an aircraft flying 3 miles above his maximum altitude. These men acted with courage even as the system around them descended into confusion. Khrushchev exploited the incident brilliantly for propaganda purposes, but his humiliation of Eisenhower came at a cost. The Paris summit that might have reduced nuclear tensions collapsed. The chance to slow the arms race disappeared. Both nations continued building weapons that could destroy human civilization. Eisenhower left office 8 months later. In his farewell address, he warned against the military-industrial complex and the dangers of a permanent arms industry. Some historians believe the U-2 disaster haunted his final months in office, reinforcing his concerns about the national security state he had helped create. The men who sat at radar screens that May Day morning, Soviet operators tracking an impossible target and American handlers waiting for a plane that would never arrive in Norway, were caught in forces larger than themselves. They performed their duties according to their training. They could not have known that this particular flight, on this particular day, would reshape the Cold War. What remains from the incident is a record of human complexity, courage and confusion, duty and disaster. Lies told by governments and truths that emerged decades later. The U-2 program represented both the heights of American technological achievement and the depths of Cold War paranoia. The Soviet response represented both legitimate national defense and catastrophic friendly fire. May 1, 1960, showed the world that even in the nuclear age, history still turned on individual moments. A pilot looking at his malfunctioning autopilot and deciding to press on. A missile commander ordering his crew to fire. A premier deciding to spring a trap rather than quietly negotiate. Each choice led to consequences no one could fully foresee. Francis Gary Powers, descending beneath his parachute toward that ploughed Soviet field, could not have known what lay ahead. He knew only that he had survived, that he was about to be captured, and that his life would never be the same. In that moment between sky and earth, between freedom and imprisonment, he faced the fundamental uncertainty that defines human existence. What came next was imprisonment, trial, exchange, and finally vindication decades after his death. What came next for the world was the hardening of Cold War lines and years more of nuclear tension. What came next for the Soviet Union was 3 decades of official lies about what actually happened that morning, followed by the gradual emergence of truth during Glasnost. The Cold War would continue for another 30 years. The Berlin Wall went up. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Vietnam consumed a generation. But throughout those decades, both superpowers continued the intelligence competition that the U-2 had pioneered. They simply moved it to orbit, where satellites replaced aircraft and photography from space, replaced photography from 70,000 feet. At 8:53 Moscow time on May 1, 1960, everything changed. The radar operators did not know it yet. Neither did the commanders scrambling to respond. Neither did the pilot at 70,000 feet, flying toward his final turn over Sverdlovsk. But history was about to pivot on this moment, this morning, this single flight that should never have launched and would never be forgotten.